Okay, well, we'll get this rolling again. Last week, you'll recall, we finished chapter 19, and at the tail end of class, I shared with you a piece called "It's Friday, but Sunday's Coming." I recall hearing that many years ago, and it's stuck with me. I do refer back to that periodically, just to recall the situation that occurred. But today we'll start by remembering where the narrative left off, and as chapter 19 closes, it's Friday. Jesus had been executed after an unlawful and prejudicial trial. His suffering had been profound. His physical torture was beyond our imagination, and there was emotional cruelty to match that physical pain and torture. He had been mocked by his judge and by those soldiers who simply chose to make sport of his claims as to who he was, and he had been abandoned by most of his companions and friends. And for the first time in his entire existence, he had been separated from his Father and placed under his Father's curse, which, as I mentioned last week, I don't think we have very significant appreciation for that and what it must have been. The disciples were scattered. Most of them were likely in hiding so that they wouldn't suffer the same fate that had just happened to Jesus. And every indication is that they were completely lost, like a sheep without their shepherd. And what of Jesus' mission and his kingdom? Well, the king is now dead, lying in a borrowed tomb. And with it, his mission. And their hope that he was the one who would now restore Israel, right? Why had he made all those promises the night before as he talked to them? And then it was Saturday. And we don't talk much about Saturday. We talk a lot about Friday, and we talk a lot about Thursday, we talk a lot about Friday, we talk a lot about Sunday, but Saturday was the high Sabbath of Passover. It was the highest religious day in the Jewish calendar, year after year. And on that day, Jews throughout the nation would recall how God had delivered his people, not just once, not just twice, but over and over again throughout their history. But this Passover, something was different. It seemed that they had been abandoned again. Just when their hopes were about to be realized, and just when they were starting to catch a glimpse of what might be. They'd watched Jesus for 3 years. They'd heard of Jesus. They'd heard all these signs and things and what was going on. But the light that had burned for those last 3 years was now being snuffed out. And the vision that it had portrayed, the picture of a loving and diligent and committed Heavenly Father, that picture was all of a sudden in ruins. And so now Sunday morning dawns. They have heavy hearts, they have broken dreams, they have hopelessness, and they have despair. And we pick up the narrative in chapter 20. Early on that first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but didn't go in. And then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. That cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen. And finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. And then the disciples went back to their homes. First thing we notice is there's a lot of running going on. Mary, after she discovers that the tomb has been opened, she runs away from the tomb to tell Peter and John, and then they turn around and run back to the tomb. But they're not running because of anything that's hopeful or good here. They're running because they're alarmed. They're running because the grave has been opened and it's now empty. On top of everything else bad that has already happened this weekend, now the body of Jesus has disappeared. It's gone. And so let's take a look now at the details of the text here. Verse 1 tells us very clearly that it was Sunday. This is now the third day of living without Jesus. We talked about this briefly back at the time Lazarus was resurrected. But the Jewish mourners would typically visit the tomb up through the third day. But on the third day, there was a major shift, and what the Jews believed was that the soul left the body on the third day. And so, truly, things were finished on that third day. And that was also felt to be the time that corruption or decay would begin to set in. And so this is sort of the final opportunity to do something with the body. It's not that the body is still dead in Jewish thought, but the soul was still hovering. Craig?
Do you know why they believed that?
No.
Was it something from God, or was it just their concoction?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what their basis for that was, other than the fact that they observed and saw that the corruption, the decay, seemed to begin on about the third day. I mean, you'd start to notice the stench and things like that of an unembalmed body. So, okay, so that's verse 1. Verse 2, notice carefully what Mary first says. First of all, she says, they. Okay? Who is she suspecting? Well, possibly grave robbers. Grave robbing was a real problem in the first century. And in fact, it was such a problem that the emperor, the Roman emperor, had issued an edict that anybody who was robbing graves could be tried and found guilty of a capital offense and be put to death for it. That was the problem they were having with grave robbers back in the first century. But more likely, it seems that she probably suspected those Jewish leaders again, the Jewish establishment. You know, think about everything they've already done to Jesus. And now they need to eliminate anything that can become a focus of Jesus' memory in the eyes of his people. If there's a body there, if there's a place where they can identify that they can go and turn that into a holy site or a special site, that could become the focus for their regenerating, even though Jesus isn't there. And the whole movement could be back on its feet again. And that's the last thing that they wanted. And then if those Roman leaders, if those Jewish leaders had taken the body, they could also produce it on demand, so that if the new followers of Jesus begin to speak about him in some way, they could say, no, he's still dead. Look, we've got the body here. So they would still be able to have that and produce it. And so it's in all likelihood, she's suspecting that those Jews have done something to this aspect of Jesus as well, just to get rid of his memory. Okay? Then she says, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb. Now remember, it told us in verse 1 that it's still dark when she's there. So we're not told if she actually looked inside and saw that the tomb was gone, or maybe she just guessed that because she saw that the stone was moved. But clearly it was a shock to her to realize that stone had been taken away. And her imagination could only run wild at that point. And then Mary said, we don't know where they have put him. Well, now John just talks about Mary Magdalene coming to the tomb, but the synoptics speak of others being with her. And so even though John just includes Mary in his narrative, this indicates that the others were there. So once again, you see, the whole gospel account is unified. It's a common account. It's not, John isn't telling a different story from what Matthew, Mark, and Luke have already shared. Okay? The synoptics tell us that those women had come to further anoint the body. Okay? They brought spices much like Nicodemus had done on Friday. And they brought the spices to anoint the body. There's some thinking that they may have been considering the possibility of moving the body to a more permanent site. Because remember, the reason Joseph's tomb was chosen was because it was convenient. It was there. They could get the body put away for the night, and then they could celebrate Sabbath, and then they could come back and dispose of it however they chose. So it's possible that they actually were considering moving the body to a more permanent site. We don't know. We don't have those details. But then in verses 3 through 8, we see this detailed description of Peter and John as they arrive at the tomb. Okay? John has already described some things in his gospel that involve himself and Peter. There have been discussions, and this has led some to think that there was a rivalry between the two of them, and that John is trying to paint himself in the most favorable posture. In this case, that he was a faster runner and he believed first. But, there's as much criticism of that as not. First of all, John probably was just simply younger than Peter. And then as far as what he believed, we'll talk about it in a little bit, but he didn't go very far with his belief either, at least not at this moment. So this really, in my mind, is another description of the two of them just simply being the most significant, the most prominent apostolic witnesses for what really happened that day. And the text even says in verse 4, it says, the literal translations will read something to the effect of, they ran together. The NIV just says both were running, but a literal interpretation that will say they ran together, even though one was a little ahead of the other. Now, don't think that this run was just a sprint for a block or two. There's about a mile that they had to cover to get from the city out to the likely site of the tomb. So they're running for a while here. And this would not have been just a sprint to get there. So it tells us something, I think, about their resolve and their concern. What is going on here? What's the truth of Mary's report? And what does this mean? John clearly arrives at the tomb first. He doesn't enter the tomb, but he sees the strips of linen that are just lying there. And what conclusions would he have drawn from that? Well, number one, it's unlikely that somebody stole the body. If they were just trying to get the body out of here, they would have not bothered to unwrap it, right? And plus, some of the more valuable things that they would have stolen the body to get were the linens and the spices that they left laying on the floor of the tomb. Makes no sense. This doesn't look like it was somebody just trying to relocate the body. Because again, why would you unwrap it? That seems like a really grotesque thing to do, to unwrap a dead body. What's that?
It would be time-consuming.
Yeah, time-consuming, for sure.
Not only that, 3 days, stinky.
Yeah, you've got the stench that's starting to arrive. Now, some have proposed that the language here indicates that the wrappings were still in the shape of Jesus' body, okay? And this all comes from the phrase in verses 5 and 6 where it says the strips of linen in both verses were lying there. That phrase, lying there, can be interpreted as standing there. And if it means standing there, then it could mean that they retained their shape. And if they retained their shape, then perhaps the body had actually just escaped from its surrounding wrappings. But we can't prove that. The language is ambiguous. The language can go either way with it. So I just say that because you're gonna hear that from time to time, that the wrappings had held their shape. We can't say that with certainty, so we don't know. But that's not the important thing. The important thing is what comes next. And verses 8 and 9 for John have to be an incredible moment. And I think, looking back, as he's sitting down now some 55, 60 years later to write this and record what his experience was, he still had to shudder as it started to dawn on him what had really happened. Because this is a moment that now John begins to kind of see through the fog. He's careful to say that he still didn't understand it all. Look at verse 9. He says they still didn't understand the scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. But somehow there's this possibility, there's this inkling that's starting to generate in his inside. And maybe something truly amazing has taken place here. Something that others are going to find unbelievable, right? But we have to be careful here, because it's clear that John didn't understand everything he was seeing. And we can't attribute him with too much understanding at this point. There's no evidence that he shared his idea with any of the others, whether we're talking about Mary Magdalene, or whether we're talking about Peter, or whether we're talking about the other apostles. The synoptics tell us that when the women came and reported to the apostles, they didn't believe them. And then when the two on the road to Emmaus met with Jesus, and Jesus was revealed to them as they broke bread, they came and reported to the apostles didn't believe them either. So John wasn't going out on a ledge here with his idea, that's for sure. He wasn't communicating the whole story to other people. We don't know if he even talked to Peter about it. And we don't know what Peter thought. So we don't know the real state of where these guys are. We do know that later in the day, in the very next episode, the next little vignette that we read about, or the next week's vignette, we're going to read that they're still hiding behind locked doors. So they're still concerned at that point. But there's a key thought here expressed in verse 8. And this is where John points us really through the rest of his book, when he says, he saw and believed. And now from this point going forward, we're going to see the accounts of Mary, we're going to see the accounts of the apostles, we're going to see the accounts of Thomas, and we're going to see the accounts on as they catch fish up in Galilee in chapter 21. And this theme of seeing and believing is going to be there in every single one of them. And then Jesus is going to say something really important. We'll spoil the punchline here, but going down to verse 29, after Thomas confesses and sees the truth of what's happened, Jesus tells him, because you have seen me, you believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and have yet believed. And so Jesus is telling us there will be others who will not have to see and yet will believe. And they're going to rely on this testimony for their understanding and for the reason that they will believe. So it's impossible for us to say exactly what degree of understanding Peter and John experienced at this point. But at least there's an inkling, there's a hope, there's a dream starting to form again. But then as we move ahead in the text, the next thing that happens is John shares the reasons for these strange findings at the tomb. And that reason is that Jesus is no longer dead. In all four gospel accounts, the first witness to the resurrection is the same, Mary Magdalene. It's not clear why that's the case. Some have inferred a special relationship existing between them, but there's no scriptural evidence for that. As we said last week, there's really very little background information that we have on Mary, other than she was from the town of Magdala. She had previously had 7 demons I said something last week that I want to clarify. I mentioned last week that the text never tells us that Jesus had cast those demons out. I want to modify that slightly because in Mark 16, verse 9, it does tell us that Jesus had thrown those demons out. The problem with Mark 16:9 is it's one of those texts that we can't be sure was part of the original book. So that's the question mark. We don't have any undisputed evidence that the text gives us about Mary's healing. Nonetheless, that doesn't mean that I don't believe Jesus did that, because I think he did. That's the sort of thing Jesus did. I'm just pointing out that the text doesn't necessarily say that. Okay. The only other thing we know about Mary Magdalene, again, as we mentioned last week, is she was one of those women from Galilee who had helped to support both Jesus and the 12 apostles in their ministry throughout Palestine for the preceding 2.5 to 3 years. So those are the only things that we really know about this Mary. The reality that Jesus is now alive is the reason that John took pains back in chapter 19 to point out that Jesus was dead. Because as we said last week, without no death, there can't be a resurrection, right? Remember all those things that were pointed out in chapter 19. First of all, the soldiers confirmed his death. They came to break his legs, and it was unnecessary because he was already dead. And if that wasn't enough, they thrust a spear into his side, which would have taken care of everything for sure. It was confirmed by the fact that the body produced both blood and water, indicating that either a deep thrust had been made, which would have been fatal by itself, or that the process of the blood components separating from the liquid components of blood had already begun to occur. So either way, that's clearly a confirmation of his death. In chapter 19, verse 35, the author takes pains to point out that he is a reliable and truthful witness. Okay? And this is just part of John's strategy as he uses throughout the gospel to give us real testimony and real evidence. It's confirmed by Pilate because Joseph of Arimathea has to go to Pilate and ask for the body. Pilate's not going to do that if the body is still alive. He wants that guy dead too. So Pilate releases the body knowing that his soldiers have given him a report that it's dead. And then there's this careful notation where the location is that the body was placed, and that it was placed in a new and previously unused crypt. So all of that information John gave us to set the stage to make sure that we understand without a question, without a doubt, that Jesus is truly dead. Craig?
Well, I don't know, maybe I'm off here. You just mentioned we don't know if it was water or components of the blood. And I think last week you might have mentioned it might have been some other fluid that might have been around the lungs. But if it were water and components of the blood, well, how come then some of the blood had broken down into water and some of it was still blood? You know, it's a component of blood.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that takes time for it to occur. In the face of death, it takes several hours for the circulation to completely, part of it's going to clot off and the other part is going
So it's potentially possible.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Already turned to water and some of it is still blood.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Some of the blood would have remained in suspension. Some of the blood would have already settled out.
You know what I find interesting is that here in 2022, we can look back at this, and medically it makes sense. Where they didn't have the medical knowledge back here when they wrote it,
Right.
They just wrote what they saw.
I've gone through this a couple of times with you, but there was an article printed in JAMA back in the 1980s, I believe, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and it was called On the Historical Death of Jesus Christ. And it went through the details as given in Scripture as to, you know, their plausibility and everything, and all the mechanisms of death and all that business. But the fascinating part to me was to watch the response to that article, because it was so heated, both sides. Many people were very complimentary to the JAMA editors for having published such a piece, and other people were just throwing rocks. And it was, I actually, I think I have communion talk next week. Maybe I'll share some of that with you again. It's a highlight. But anyhow, that's kind of where we were at. It's clear that Jesus was dead previously, and John has presented all kinds of evidence for us to believe that. So let's take a look now at chapter 20, beginning in verse 10. The disciples went back to their homes, but Mary stood outside the tomb crying. And as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They've taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they've put him." And at this she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. "Woman," he said, "why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for?" And thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet returned to the Father. Go instead to my brothers. Tell them, I am returning to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." And Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them what he had said, or told him that he had said these things to her. And the synoptics tell us they didn't believe her. So here in verse 10, Peter and John returned home. They're still trying to make sense of what they've seen at the tomb. John has an inkling of something incredible, something amazing, but he doesn't fully understand it. Verse 11 says, "But Mary stood outside the tomb." And this paints a clear distinction between the reaction of the apostles, Peter and John, versus that reaction of Mary. And perhaps the reason that Jesus appeared to her first, perhaps she's the one most ready to accept what she sees. He had really changed her life in a profound way, and he brought tremendous peace and stability to her life. But it says that she was crying or weeping, and that word there is a loud, demonstrative. This is not a quiet or silent thing. This is loud, it's audible. Everybody knows she is filled with grief that the body is gone. It says she bent over to look into the tomb, which gives us an idea that the tomb wasn't this high. It's probably something that you had to bend over to see into. Okay? She saw two angels there, seated. The synoptics make it clear that these were identifiable as angelic beings, so there was no doubt about their appearance. But nonetheless, Mary seems to have tunnel vision. She's just focused really on her grief. And they ask her, "Why the tears? Why the tears, Mary?" It's almost a bit of a reprimand. Maybe she should be farther along than what she is. But her tunnel grief, her tunnel vision, due to her grief, is understandable. Maybe what's going on here too is the fact that she came there with an agenda. She came there to anoint the body, and now that's not going to happen. And I don't know why. So maybe it's the fact that her agenda's been hijacked. Maybe that's why she's, so unseeing at this moment. Craig?
Another observation that I'm seeing is the angels didn't scare her at all. She didn't seem afraid. But don't we have scriptures that talk about people that encountered angels and were in fear of
In different places, yes. Absolutely. But we also have scriptures where people entertained angels unaware.
Right.
So we see all this wide variety of angelic beings and their appearances, for sure. Okay? So she sees the angels, and she expresses to them her greatest concern. And her biggest concern is, where's the body now? Who's done this? Okay? But then in verse 14, the resurrected Christ appears to her. She doesn't recognize him. And that's going to be the pattern. There are going to be several that do not recognize Jesus when they see him. And kind of file that away, because it leads to questions about what his appearance was really like. Okay? Just kind of file that away in the back of your mind. We'll talk about that a little more later on.
Aaron,
Yes, ma'am.
my logical mind says
Don't know. Maybe the group was big enough that they thought betwixt the gang they would be able to do it. Maybe the group was big enough. Maybe the stone wasn't as big as we've always pictured either. I don't know. But it was pretty clear that they wondered about rolling away the stone. And one of the texts tells us that, doesn't it? Yeah. I don't remember. It's not here. It's not in John, but it's in one of the synoptics. Maybe one of you could find that for us, that there's an indication that they weren't sure how they were going to get the stone out of the way anyhow. Jesus now asks the same question of her that the angels have just asked. Why the tears, Mary? And she again responds the same sort of way. The body's been taken, and maybe you have taken it. Mark tells us.
Yeah.
What's Mark say?
Mark said, and they were saying to one another, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?
Yeah, who will roll the stone away? Now, they probably thought the guard was still there too, so maybe the soldiers were going to help with that. Maybe because remember they had posted a guard that we don't read about in John at all. So perhaps they thought the soldiers would help them. I don't know. So Jesus asked the same question, Mary, why the tears? She again expresses her concern about what's happened to the body, and she speaks to Jesus, not realizing it's Jesus, and said, if you're the gardener and if you've put him somewhere else just to get him out of the way, where? What? You know, I want to see it. I want to be there. And then his voice. And that's what it took. When he said her name, he said Mary, and the identification was made. I can remember Rose and I were on vacation up in, we were up in the Traverse City, Petoskey area. We went up into a Harbor Springs, and we walked into a Hallmark store there in Harbor Springs. And I no more than walked in the door, and somebody in the back of the building yelled, "Aaron!" And I instantly recognized her voice, and it was somebody I'd gone to high school with, because she has this real distinctive, shrill voice. And it was a Mary of all thought, but her name was Mary. And, you know, for some of us, we can almost remember voices more than we can seeing somebody. And you know, a lot of times voices remain more constant than vision does or appearance does. So anyhow, Mary clearly recognized Jesus as he spoke her name. And what a tender moment that had to be. What a tender moment that had to be. And Mary responds, and this is beautiful too, this Rabboni is not just, it's not just teacher, it's my teacher, it's personal. And so that's her response back to Jesus, is my teacher. And she had to be just filled with absolute amazement. Verse 17 is a challenging passage. And it probably is not mistranslated, but they could have done a better job here, probably, with the text. In all likelihood, Mary, when she recognized Jesus, she grabbed him. She ran to him and grabbed him. And what it looks like this should be saying is something along the line. I don't think Jesus is saying, don't touch me or you're going to get zapped, which is kind of the way that we interpret this, where it says, don't hold on to me, for I've not yet returned to my Father. Okay? What he's really saying here is, you don't need to clutch at me. I'm not going anywhere yet. Okay? I'm still here. Don't feel like you have to hold me. And in fact, I want you to go tell my brothers. I got a message for them. Okay? And so he sends her off with this message. And the message is incredible. What does he want to tell? What does he want Mary to tell his brothers? I'm returning to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. I want you to notice two things out of that. Number one, he doesn't say, I will return. He says, I am returning. The process of returning to his Father has already begun. The ascension of Jesus is not something that just happened on a hillside a few weeks later when he rose up to heaven and disappeared from their sight. It's already started. It's already happening. His ascension, his leaving, his glorification. Remember that term that we've used that John's used over and over and over throughout this book. So he is returning even now. But then, notice the terms he used. These are terms of family. They're terms of endearment. They're terms of familiarity. And these are terms that Jesus only uses now that he has paid the price for their sins. Listen to what he says. He says, tell my brothers, I am returning to my Father and your Father. I'm returning to my God and your God. Jesus is sharing the very same relationship that he has with his Father and with his God. He is sharing that now with his brothers. And that is the beauty of the cross. That is what the cross has now accomplished. Christ is together with his brothers. There's a new intimacy between them, and they all share the same common bond with their Father and with their God. And then in verse 18, Mary followed through as Jesus asked her to do. She reported her experience to the others, but as we have mentioned, according to the synoptics, they didn't believe her. Crazy woman. Get it together, would you?
Well,
Little did they know.
She probably was so mournful, they probably thought that
She saw
having
things.
hallucinations
Yeah.
or psychotic episode or something.
But soon they too will be confronted by this reality that Jesus has indeed risen from the dead. And then all the pieces will fit together.
Aaron?
Yes, sir.
Notice that she said, I have seen the Lord.
I have seen the Lord.
Her
Yeah.
commitment was definitely,
Yeah.
you know.
I have seen the Lord.
Yeah.
What a great statement, eh? Great statement. And so we close our class today in this Resurrection Sunday morning with the first resurrected appearance of Jesus to Mary Magdalene. Clearly he was dead 2 days ago. There can be no question of that this body, when it was placed in the tomb, was lifeless. But now he is as alive could ever be. And now John will conclude his gospel over the next chapter and a half by sharing more experiences that will take this experience and make it believable to those of us who are reading. Mary, even they tried to explain it away, but they're not done yet. It keeps coming. It keeps coming at them, and the real truth of what happened here just simply can't be denied when you get done with it. And that's why later on in this next, it'll be our next class section, but it's later on in this chapter, we come to that verse that we've been talking about for the whole book, that these things are written that we might believe. And that's what they're here for. John is presenting a compelling story to us, so we have no choice but to arrive at the same conclusion that they did. Jesus was dead and is now alive. What a fantastic ending to this book. So, we've got a couple more weeks here. Be here next week, and we'll take the next step. God is good